I'm Hanan Khalifa, Head of Research and International Development, and this is my colleague Corinne Doherty, Senior Research and Validation Manager.
Hello.
Welcome to our webinar on understanding and using the CFR to teaching and learning. Cambridge Assessment was established 150 years ago, and we are a not-for-profit organization. We work internationally in English language learning, teaching, and assessment, and we are one of the largest examination boards worldwide. We are also a department of Cambridge University comprising 3 examination boards, as well as the largest research capability of its kind. We advise governments and NGOs, and we partner with industry leaders to deliver the best products and services. As you can see from the map, Cambridge English Language Assessment has around 4 million candidates from all over the world, and I'm so glad to see that so many of you have joined us today. There are over 2,700 authorized test centers in 130 countries, with approximately 20,000 examiners. Over 13,500 organizations and around the world accept Cambridge English exams as proof of English language ability. The number continues to grow year on year. As well as submitting papers to academic journals and presenting at conferences, we share our experience and research findings with the wider language assessment community through our own publications. One of these publications is Studies in Language Testing, or SILT, a series of academic volumes published jointly by Cambridge English Language Assessment and Cambridge University Press. The series examines important issues and new developments in language testing that are relevant to test users, developers, and researchers. Another one of our publications is Research Notes, which is free and comes out 4 times a year. Articles in Research Notes focus on teaching, learning, and assessment. You can find out more about SILT and Research Notes on the Cambridge English website. We picked a couple of our publications that might be of interest to you today: SILT Volumes 27 and 33 and Issue 37 of Research Notes. All of these focus on the CFR and may be of interest to participants who would like to explore the topic further. Today, we will start by talking about the origins, aims, and uses of the CFR before looking into more detail at the illustrative scales, examining the key features that distinguish each level from the other. We will then focus on how, as teachers, we can use the scales in our own daily practices. You may have heard people refer to the Common European Framework of Reference in different ways, such as CFR, CFR, or CEF. More and more people are dropping the E for European, showing that the framework is used beyond Europe, despite originating in Europe. And I could see that we have people from Latin America, from the Middle East as well joining us today. In this presentation, we will use the term CFR without the E. Since its publication by the Council of Europe in 2001, the CFR has had a wide impact on the teaching and learning of languages around the world. It is used by many educational institutions, assessment organizations, and publishers because it provides language practitioners with a common language to describe language ability, which is language neutral and context neutral. In other words, it can be used to describe proficiency in any language and across cultures. To support its use by a variety of people, it has been translated into 39 languages, which are listed on the Council of Europe website. Let me stop here and ask, how many of you work in an organization that describe language learning using the CFR? Please choose the tick for yes or the cross for no. Okay, so we have a mix. Of people who work in organizations which uses the CFR. I think we have around 200. It's coming up now.
There you go.
So we've got 31% who already use the CFR and 10% who do not work in an organization that use CFR. I'm not sure about the none.
People who haven't answered yet.
Okay. So Corinne actually will start talking to you about the different levels of the CFR.
Thank you, Hanan. The CFR describes language ability at 6 levels, with A1 being the lowest level and C2 the highest. For each level, the CFR describes in depth the language knowledge, skills, and competencies needed for effective communication. The levels are grouped into 3 broad categories, with A1 and A2 describing a basic user, B1 and B2 describing an independent user, while C1 and C2 refer to a proficient user of a language. Because the CFR has clearly defined levels of language ability, educational authorities, exam boards, and publishers are increasingly making explicit reference to it by linking their curriculum, tests, and textbooks to the CFR. Here is an example of a textbook from Cambridge University Press that has linked their course material to a particular CFR level. As you can see, it is linked to B2. But be careful. You should always look at the evidence being used to make these claims in order to make sure the evidence is appropriate. Now, let's consider some of the reasons people use the CFR. We've provided a list here of the most common reasons, and we'd like to ask you which of these uses is most relevant for you. Read through the list, A to D, and then type in the chat box the letter of the reason which is most important for you. I can see many people are typing in A and B. There's a few people typing in D. So we're getting most of the answers, but it seems A is probably the most popular. But the important thing to remember is that you can use the CFR for all of these reasons. Now I'd like to pass you over to Hanan, who will talk to you about the different types of scales.
Thanks, Corinne. So far we have discussed the background of the CFR and why people use it. Now let's take a look at the scales in detail. The global scale is the one that has the most general description of language ability, whereas the individual scales describe language ability for very specific activities, knowledge, and uses. We will start by discussing the most general scale, the global scale, then the illustrative scales, and finally the self-assessment scale. Let's look at some example descriptors from the global scale within the CFR. Please read the statement and decide whether it describes a basic user, an independent user, or a proficient user. Use the polling buttons A, B, or C. Please choose now. Well, I could see that there's a range. Some of you have clicked on an A, some of you have clicked on B. So we've got around 24% on B and 18% on C. Well, it is describing an independent user, so option B is the correct response. But that's the whole idea of familiarization, to get it right, so we need to try it more than once. Now, let's do the same for descriptor 2. Is it describing a basic user, an independent user, or a proficient user? Please choose polling button A, B, or C now. Okay, on this one, there seems to be more of an agreement that it's A, and actually A is the correct response. How about if we look at descriptor 3? Which level is it describing? Please choose polling button A, B, or C now. Again, I could see that most of you have chosen C, which is the correct response. Now, for those who've selected B or did not select the right level, I just want to assure you that A, you're doing it very quickly, and B, once you do this again, you would start highlighting keywords that will make a difference between one level and the other, and it's only then that you will see at which level it belongs to, the statement belongs to it. Have a look at the global scale handout to see how the descriptors vary from one level to another. One of the best ways to familiarize yourself with the CFR levels is to highlight or underline the features which distinguish one level from another. Look especially at the adjacent levels, so A1 and A2, A2 and B1, and so on. Let's do an example. What are some of the key differences between A2 and B1? Look at your handout and underline the key differences. Okay, here are some of the key differences between A2 and B1. As you can see, learners at the A2 level can understand sentences and frequent expressions. This means A2 learners are primarily able to handle short, simple, and clearly structured input, where meaning is located within the sentence and not across sentences. Whereas B1 learners are able to understand the main points, which suggest slightly longer input text, where meaning is built up across sentences. In terms of what they can produce in writing, A2 learners are able to produce texts that contain a series of sentences related to direct exchanges of information and focus on routine tasks. Whereas B1 learners can produce longer texts in which ideas are connected and the range of topics is expanding. Finally, looking at speaking, B1 learners can describe experiences and opinions in more detail than A2 learners, who are still only able to think about topics of a personal, immediate nature in a limited way. Now that you're a little bit more familiar with the global scale, Corinne will talk about the more detailed scales, which are called the illustrative scales.
Thank you, Hanan. There are more than 50 illustrative scales in the CFR, and they can be found in chapters 4 and 5 of the book. The illustrative scales are grouped into 3 main categories: language activities, which cover the 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking; language strategies, which are needed to achieve the language activities; and finally, language competencies, which cover the linguistic and sociolinguistic knowledge needed to communicate. These subscales cover different areas but are applied to the same 6 levels of A1 to C1. Now let's look at the scales in more detail, starting with language activities. According to the CFR, language learning is an activity in which the learner performs tasks in order to communicate or interact with others. As a result, the majority of scales fall under language activities. As you can see, language activities are broken down into production, which is speaking and writing, reception, reading and listening, and interaction, all skills. We'll start by looking at the productive scales, but you can see the full diagram of all the language activities on your handout. As you can see, there are 5 scales under spoken production and 3 under written production. And for each scale, there are descriptors for each of the 6 reference levels, A1 to C2. Here's an example of an illustrative scale for public announcements, which is part of the scale spoken production. You'll notice that there is no descriptor at the A1 level. This is because this activity is likely too challenging for learners at the A1 level. At C2, the descriptor doesn't exist because C1 likely represents the highest level for this particular activity. It's important to remember that as you move up the scale, it's assumed that you can perform the activities in the lower levels. Before we move on, we would like to mention that not all scales will be relevant for all learning contexts, and teachers need to select the scales that are important for their learners. For example, the creative writing scale may not be useful for students learning English for business purposes. Which of the speaking and writing subscales would be most useful in your context? Type your response into the chat box now. Okay, I can see someone about speaking, both, oral production. It's very fast. I can see a lot of speaking and oral production, a few for writing. Very good. So now let's turn and look at the receptive scales. The listening and reading scales are listed on the slide and on your handout. As you can see, there are 5 listening subscales and 5 for reading. The subscale for watching TV and film can involve both reading and listening if subtitles are involved. So which of the listening scales do you think would be most relevant for a learner who works for a multinational company and must attend meetings in English? Type your answer in the chat box now. So we've had understanding, interaction, a member of an audience, overall listening. Yes, probably the main subscale that would be relevant for this type of learner would be listening as a member of a live audience, or understanding interactions between native speakers may also be relevant. The last group of scales under language activities are classified as interactive because they involve more than one skill, such as listening and speaking or listening and writing, and so on. These scales recognize that language is a communicative activity that is driven by a particular goal or purpose. Here's a descriptor from one of the interactive subscales. Which one do you think it relates to? So you can see someone said conversation, informal discussions, informal exchange, conversation. Yes, the actual answer is it's from the scale informal discussions. So we have looked at all the language activity scales now, which is, as we said, are the largest number of scales. Now we'll look at the rest of the scales. Here you can see the scales for language strategies. These scales cover the strategies learners will likely need to successfully achieve the language activities. You'll notice again that these scales are grouped into production, reception, and interaction. Although you will likely need to select the most relevant language activity subscales for your context, all of the language strategy subscales should be relevant unless particular skills are not being taught. Are all of these strategies relevant for your learners? Choose the tick or cross to vote. So tick for yes if all of these strategies are relevant for your learners, or cross for no if they aren't. So we can see that many people are selecting yes, and a few people are saying some of them aren't relevant. And this is important, so we see that 42% have said yes, they are relevant, and about 4% have said no. So very interesting. So again, you use the CFR depending on your context, so you need to select those scales or subscales that are relevant for your particular learners. So let's move on. The last group of scales relate to the language competencies and cover the linguistic, pragmatic, and sociolinguistic knowledge that learners will need to communicate at each level. For example, under the scale vocabulary range, there are descriptors. Here are the descriptors for different levels. You'll notice for A2 that there are 2 descriptors. The one above the line is called the plus level, or A2 plus. This descriptor is at a higher level than the descriptor below the line, but still within the A2 level. Because the CFR is language neutral, the linguistic scales do not specify which grammar or vocabulary are appropriate at the different levels. So you must decide what specific grammatical forms of vocabulary should be taught at each level. The global and detailed illustrative scales are useful for teachers when deciding on what to teach, but when you're working with students, you will probably find it useful to have more detail. The self-assessments grid, which is on your handout, is specifically designed for learners. Notice the I can instead of the can do format. The self-assessment grid describes what learners can do in terms of reception, interaction, and production. If you look at the descriptor on the slide, which of these, reception, interaction, or production, do you think this refers to? Please type your answer in the chat box. So we want to know whether it's reception, production, or interaction. So most of you have gotten the right answer. It is, of course, reception, and it's about listening. So could you now decide what level you think this refers to? Is it referring to A1, B1, or B2? Please choose your answer now using the polling button. Okay, so most people did say B, which is B1. Second most popular was A2. It is in fact B1 level. You should be able to find this descriptor on your handout. Look at the self-assessment grid. You can use the self-assessment scales with your learners to help them understand where they are and what they still need to learn, which we will discuss later. But before that, I'll pass things over to Hanan.
Thank you, Corinne. Now that we have familiarized ourselves with the CFR and the illustrative scales, let's check if we are on the right track. Here's a statement. The CFR scales should be used to describe, not to prescribe. Vote on whether you think this is true or false. Well, I'm happy to see that most of you have said that it is true. Definitely, the CFR was developed as a planning tool. It doesn't promote a particular language teaching methodology or a path to learning. How about this statement? Do you think it is true or false? Please also use the voting buttons. Okay, so, right, so 20, am I reading this correct? I can't see.
25% say true.
So 25% says it's true and 17% says it's false. When we talk about the CFR scales as a seal of approval, I think what you might be thinking of is the logo that you would see on certain textbook publishers, on certain textbooks, where some people would say that the textbooks have been aligned to the CFR while others haven't. However, we can't really say that it is a seal of approval because the CFR is a bank of descriptors. It is not a measurement scale, and there isn't actually a single test method, which is a single best method of carrying out curriculum or exam alignment. The CFR can be used to provide evidence of the claims being made, but you need to look at the claims closely to make sure you can rely on them. to really say to yourself, yes, they have been aligned to the CFR. How about the following statement? Do you think it is true or false? Okay, most of you said it's true, some said it's false. I'd just like to stop here. I mean, I think this is sort of a tricky statement to respond to. It has 6 broad levels, but for example, it does not break it down to be 1.1 or 1.2 or 1.3 or 1.4. What you'll find, the practice in language schools, for example, is that they will break each broad level of the CFR into either 2 levels, 3 levels, or 4 sub-levels. And also Corinne had showed you in one of the slides that, for example, in certain levels, there isn't a can-do descriptor at C2. So in some cases, you couldn't find can-do descriptors. The scales are not really exhaustive, and they are meant to be adapted and added to as the situation arises. Now that we have familiarized ourselves with the CFR and the scales, an important question to ask ourselves is, why do I want to follow the CFR in my teaching? What do you think? Please type an answer in the chat box. Okay, so some said reliability helps me to set goals, yes. Objective assessment. Okay, here are some possible response that we came up with. It is a common reference point for people working within an institution or across institution when talking about the same language level. So when Corinne says intermediate, or if she says B2, I will understand more what a B2 is rather than what an intermediate is, because her intermediate may not be my intermediate. It makes it easier to compare language qualifications. It is definitely our best hope to answer the question, how do I know that my level B1 is your level B1, and in what way do they vary? The CFR can play a useful role in matters of quality assurance, contributing to the quality of test content, curriculum design, and supporting professionalization of language assessment. Finally, its growing influence in Europe and beyond cannot be ignored. Education ministries, syllabus designers, coursebook publishers, and assessment providers are all now taking account of the CFR if they haven't already done so. Are you convinced? Do you think you may use the CFR more than you do now? Please vote yes or no. So far we haven't got a no, so that's good. Oh, we've got one now, 2. Right, but so the majority of you said yes, thank you. In order to make the most out of the CFR, you need to start by A, defining your context and your learners. B, familiarizing yourself with the scales, in the same way that we have showed you today. Once you have done this, then you can select the appropriate scales for your context. Do this as a teamwork. Remember that the scales are not exhaustive, so you may need to adapt some descriptors to better fit your context of use. If you feel the need to have B1.1 or B1.2, there are lots of different places that you can go to in order to fill these gaps. Finally, refer to the levels when developing lessons or assessing your learners. I'll now pass you over to Corinne, who's going to talk to you about using the CFR in your teaching context.
Thanks, Anand. Let's look at some practical ideas about how you can use the CFR self-assessment scales in your classroom. Here are 3 can-do statements for reading at the A2 level. They've been taken from the checklists, which are available on the Council of Europe website, and we'll give you the web address for those later. Have a look at these statements and think about which reading skill is most important for your students. You can choose polling button A, B, or C if you think one of these statements is most important, Or if you think they're equally important, select letter D. You can vote on that now using the polling button under your name. So I can see many people are picking A, and then D is also probably second runner-up at the moment. And a few people are picking B and C. So A, 24% of you think, that's right, 24% of you have picked D, where they're all relevant, and then that's followed by A at 10%, and then B and C at 7%. So let's think about the benefits of using these can-do statements. Imagine that you're teaching a class of students at A2 level, and you've just shown these students the can-do statements for reading that we've just seen. What are the benefits of doing this? The first benefit that we came up with is that the can-do statements break down language skills into specific areas. So rather than students saying that they need to work on their reading, they can identify areas of reading which need more practice. For example, understanding instructions. This will help to make learning more achievable by looking at specific things rather than the overall picture. Before we go on to look at other benefits, perhaps you could tell us what benefits you believe there are. Type your ideas in the chat box now. So that is what benefits of using the can-do statements with your students. So improving oral skills, positive thinking, self-assessment, boost confidence, awareness. So a lot of good ideas out there. So if students look at these can-do statements regularly and assess what they can do, they will start to see progress as they tick off more of the statements on the list each time. This can be very motivating, as you said, for students. It also allows students and teachers to monitor areas where they are not making progress. Perhaps they need more help from the teacher with a specific area, or more opportunities to practice. In this way, the statements can be used as a diagnostic tool. They can also give students a sense of achievement. When students feel they can do approximately 80% of the statements on a list, then they may be ready to move up to the next level. The statements themselves can be used as a resource. The fact that students will discuss their learning requirements using the can-do statements means that they will be assimilating this language into their personal bank of knowledge. Now Hanan will talk to you about the different ways you can present these statements to your students. Hanan?
Okay, thanks. An easy way to present can-do statements to your students is to select just a few of them at a time to present to your class. You could present them like this and allow your students to shade the sections that they are good at. They then need to focus on the unshaded areas. It would be useful to present all of the can-do statements for a particular skill in a table like this one. For the purpose of this webinar, we're just using the same 3 statements as an example. Students could then tick or put a smiley face when they can do something, and use similar ways to show the areas that they still need to work on. Putting a date next to the can-do statement can also help students to keep track of their progress. If we want to take the table idea further, then we can use it to set goals and show progress simply by adding columns like the ones here. The teacher or students can decide what the focus of the columns should be. You may want to look at how well students can do a particular task. This is quite a positive way of looking at progress and achievements. As you can see, the dates here becomes more significant and give a clear sense of progress. Note the empty rows at the bottom of the table. It is possible to make a checklist that includes everything a learner can do at a certain level, so it's important to leave a few blank spaces at the end of any checklist. This allows the learner to add in points that are important to them. The personalization of the list can also increase motivation for learners, as the list becomes something that they have ownership of, rather than just a series of statements that has been imposed on them or that the teacher had just given them. And to expand on this last point, you can use the can-do statements as the basis of a learner contract. So imagine this: a learner comes to your students and you decide with them to write a contract. So a learner contract is something your students write, with your support of course, that sets down the learning objectives for the course and the strategy they will use to achieve them. The goal of a learner contract is to help students take responsibility for their own learning by requiring them to reflect on their strengths and weaknesses, which ultimately should increase their motivation. To help students create a learner contract, you can provide them with a list of can-do statements relevant to the course. Then they can decide which ones are most relevant for them to work on, and then decide on activities or strategies to help make improvements. The contract is then used by learners to track their progress toward their goals.
Great, thanks, Hanan. Now let's look at some classroom activities that you can use related to the can-do statements. First, it's important for you as a teacher to understand the types of tasks used in a test or in tests for your learners. So a first step to using the CFR in the classroom is to analyze test tasks in order to determine the types of activities that your learners require. The next two activities are from the Cambridge English Key Reading Test. Have a look at the activity on the right and the can-do statements that we've been talking about on the left. Which can-do statements in this exam task is it targeting? Take some time to have a look, then select your answer using the polling button A, B, or C. Okay, I can see many people are putting A, a few people are putting B, very few responses for C. All right, so the majority of people have selected A, which is the right answer. It is a task that requires learners to understand signs and notices. However, the people that also put B are not completely wrong. It also requires students to understand instructions, like do not go into the water, which is option B. So it involves both of those descriptors. Now have a look at this exam task. Again, decide which can-do statements on the left this task targets. Using the polling buttons to select your answer A, B, or C when you've had time to look at the exam task. So I can see many people are picking C. There are some responses for B as well. Okay, the majority have selected C, which is the correct answer. It does require students to find information in an article. However, it also does require students to understand the instructions at the top of the page, which involves option B. Now let's look at how you can introduce more action into the classroom with some can-do statements for speaking at the A2 level. Imagine that this slide is a floor plan of your classroom, with each side of the slide being the walls of your classroom. Why not pin some can-do statements to the walls in your class like this? Imagine that your students are in the middle of the classroom and they need to look at all four walls to read the can-do statements A to D. Have a read of these statements now. Now imagine you are a student standing in the middle of the class and you need to choose a can-do statement that you want to work on. You may want to work on more than one of these, but you need to prioritize and choose the one that is most important to you at this moment in time. In your class, your students would walk to the statement that is most important to them. This is a very physical activity, and as you now have the students in groups, you could get them to sit down and talk to each other about why they want to work on this area and what they could do to improve it. You could also have a list of activities ready for each group of students. For example, look at the activity in the blue bubble and decide which of the 4 can-do statements it relates to. Please choose the polling button A, B, C, or D that you think this activity will help. Okay, we can see a lot of people are selecting C. And a few people are selecting B. But yes, the answer is C, so you're correct. Now have a look at this activity in the blue bubble and decide which can-do statement, A to D, this helps most. Again, select your answer using your polling buttons. Again, I can see a lot of people are selecting B. And some people are selecting A now. Not many are going for D. Yes, so the majority have selected B, and in fact that is the answer. So I hope you found these activities useful and can see yourself using some of them in your classroom. I'll now pass you over to Hanan, who will summarize the webinar.
Hopefully the activities that we have looked at have shown you that it is straightforward to use key CFR can-do statements in your class. No doubt you're already using them all the time. You may just need to make your students aware of what they are. This will help clarify what your students need to work on and what they can already do. And it should also increase their motivation and bring a sense of achievement into your class. So to summarize, in the webinar today, we've aimed to clarify the aims and uses of the CFR. Next, we looked at the different types of scales and considered which ones are relevant for different users. Then we talked about how you can use the scales in your classroom in particular, the usefulness of the self-assessment scales in creating learner contracts, and how the can-do statements can be used as the basis for developing your own lesson plans. We hope you've enjoyed the webinar and found it useful. Okay, we had a couple of questions related to each other about the use of the CFR within European context and outside Europe. I think what we've tried to say is lots of people have really dropped the E. The CFR is being used in Japan, in China, in Latin America, in Mexico, etc. So yes, it can be used in other contexts. If you look onto the Council of Europe website, it has been translated to around 39 different languages, including Chinese. It's also in Arabic, for example. So yes, you can definitely use it within your own context. I understand that the WIDA Consortium in the US and the ACTFL are now aligning their own ACTFL guidelines to the CFR, so even the US is now aligning to the CFR. Forget about the E within the CFR.
Thanks, Hanan. Someone has also asked about if there's something we could call a pre-A1 level. As we said, the scales are not exhaustive, and there is speakers above C2, and people are actually looking at that right now. And there's also obviously beginners that are below the A1 level. And that's where you need to look at the scales and define for your own context what's relevant for those particular learners, depending upon what they are hoping to achieve in your class. At the moment, most people just refer to it as below A1. Do you have anything to add with that, Hanan?
No.
Another question has come from...
Well, there has been a question about whether the CFR is a standard or a framework. It's called the Common Framework of Reference. So it really is a framework. However, lots of people in different parts of the world are using it as a standard. So it is a framework that is being used as a standard. It could be quite, what's the word? Could be quite
Confusing?
confusing, yes. Yes. Use it, please use it as a framework. And that's why one of our statement is that we said, is the CFR, should it be used as a Bible? Is it descriptive or prescriptive? It is definitely descriptive.
And it's important that CFR is designed for teachers to reflect on their own practice and to talk to each other, just as you're doing here today, and share their experiences, and also the CFR is meant to develop with those experiences. An important question that we want to make sure that someone has asked is whether the materials are available online, and they are. If you do go to the Council of Europe website, which is part of will be sent to you in the documentation, you can get all the can-do statements as well as the self-assessment statements on free online, and you can download the English version of the CFR and find out where you can access the translated versions.
You can also download the learner contract. If you go to the Equals Alte website, there's quite a few of them over there. A learner contract, you can do it yourself. You can decide on what are the columns, like Kareem mentioned, and what are the different statements as well. So you can adapt it. It's something that is easy to do, but it's also I think the beauty of the concept is that it commits the students and the teacher to achieving the same goal and working towards the same goal.
Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for today, Hanan. So thank you very much for attending. We look forward to seeing you at our future webinars, and thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.